Oh boy, here we go again. It never ceases to amaze me how developers manage to continuously up the ante in regards to difficulty, especially in the Souls-like space. While I remember thinking that Shadow of the Erdtree seemed like it was going to be ridiculously difficult, particularly from its opening few moments, with some of the first encounters, the first enemies and mini-bosses that you come across, that expansion did eventually settle into a groove, and for the most part the difficulty was manageable, even if it was across the board, I would say, tougher than the main game. Then we had the first Berserker Kazan earlier this year, which, while it hasn't yet received a substantial DLC expansion, its base game became without a doubt the toughest Souls-like I had ever played. Enter Lies of P Overture. Now, I mentioned in my previous video, by the way, a huge thank you to everyone for the wonderful reception that video received, how I was making my way through a brand new playthrough of Lies of P, something that I had been meaning to do before the expansion was suddenly shadow dropped during the Summer Game Fest showcase last week, and that kind of expedited my plans, and so that was pushed to the top of my to-do list. And, well, I recently finished the game once again, meaning it was finally time, at last, to move on to the DLC. And Lies of P was just as wonderful as I remembered it. I finished everything the game had to offer back in 2023 and was very excited to jump into this totally new, and by all accounts, meaty expansion the team had been working on for some time. Except, well, to my grim surprise, Overture is quite a bit tougher than I think I was expecting it to be. It's quite a bit harder than I was anticipating, to be totally honest, even though I made sure not to jump into the DLC on my original New Game Plus 3 playthrough from 2023. This is a fresh playthrough, a fresh endgame save file, and I am getting steamrolled, for lack of a better word, by almost everything I've come across so far. But then again, perhaps I should have expected this. There's almost always a jump in difficulty when you access a Souls-like DLC, even if you are at the end game of the base game, because by all counts, these expansions are generally tailored to an end game experience. That comes with the territory, but I mean, this new playthrough of Overture is making the Old Hunters, which I also just played recently, feel like a cakewalk by comparison, let me tell you. Now, to be fair, there are a bunch of variables at play here. For one, I think I'm better at Bloodborne and its core mechanics than I am at Lies of P, despite loving both. And that's not to say, from the very limited amount of time I've had with the DLC so far, that I don't think Overture is good. I do. And in this video, I'll be discussing what I like about it so far, as well as what feels, at least on the surface, like a major difficulty spike right out the gate. But truth be told, like I said, I haven't put much time into it yet, and I haven't got that far. So this really is as fresh as impressions can be, and the majority of those impressions involve taking a serious beating at every turn. So, in today's video, I want to give some very early impressions of Lies of P Overture, including how it seems to be almost absurdly difficult, from the perspective of, as I've said before, a fairly average player, but someone who has finished this game previously with no summons on what is apparently the hardest difficulty based on the new difficulty settings. But I'd love to know your thoughts on the DLC down below. How are you finding it in comparison to the base game, and how does it compare to other Souls-like DLCs and expansions that you've played previously? Do please let me know down in the comments. And of course, before we really get started on the video, consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. Maybe you're new to the channel, or maybe you're one of the 90% of viewers that aren't currently subscribed. Either way, it's very easy to do, and your support would go a hugely long way. It is greatly appreciated. So, for starters, a bit of context on my current playthrough. As noted in my previous video, I played through the game on Legendary Stalker difficulty to try and emulate the 2023 original as best as possible, and at the time of completion and defeating the nameless puppet, I was level 93. I'm running a technique build, and my favourite weapon is still the Puppet Ripper after all these years, for its high damage and immaculate crowd control. All in all, the game was, for the most part, very much as I remembered it, except it honestly felt a little easier across the board. And I know that's rich considering the context of this video, but it did. For the most part, I never found myself at a roadblock, at a point in the game that felt truly difficult to overcome, and maybe that can just be attributed to the fact that I've played and finished this game before. For example, there were sections of the final area, the Arch Abbey, that I remember being very frustrating back in the day outside of the boss fights, but I didn't really experience any of that this time. And going one step further, speaking of the boss fights, some bosses that gave me real trouble before, whether these were earlier bosses like Fuoko, the Archbishop, the King of Puppets, right the way through to late game bosses like the Corrupted Parade Master, for example, genuinely didn't feel as hard as I remembered them being. So perhaps that lulled me into a false sense of security going into Overture. Now, to be fair, bosses like the Green Monster of the Swamp, Laxasia, and the Nameless Puppet, they were all still pretty difficult, but I mean, I don't think I was hard stuck on any of them in the same way I found myself back in 2023. And to be honest, I don't know what that means. There's simply no way I suddenly got better at the game, although I will say that in the wake of newer games like Shadow of the Erd Tree, Kazan, and even Night Rain, for example, a lot of the bosses in Lies of P, even the tougher fare, do feel inherently simpler and easier to manage on the whole, and maybe even strike a perfect balance between the meticulous nature of Bloodborne's fights and the absolute craziness of some of Elden Ring's bosses. It's a little bit like when you go back to Dark Souls 1 and discover the majority of boss fights in that game are actually a bit of a joke. They are remarkably easy because the ante has been cranked up so significantly over the years and iterations that you yourself as a player have grown. Your skill levels have gone up in ways you didn't even really notice. Anyway, that gives you a bit of context about where I was at before starting up Overture. But truth be told, I initially couldn't wait. I unlocked the DLC Stargazer the moment it became available to me, after Chapter 9 I think it was, and promptly was torn a new one by several of the new and old enemies. So, despite getting a tantalizing glimpse at Overture, I resolved to finish the main game first, and then level up a bit more. But man, I was not expecting the experience I've had so far with Overture. Let's start with the DLC's smallest enemies, and the ones who have returned from the base game so far. Despite having, something like 40 points in Vitality, regular mob enemies are killing me in 2, maybe 3 hits. And this is not on any kind of New Game Plus. Obviously, it's on me for getting hit in the first place, but for someone like me who just isn't that good at deflecting attacks, having such a beefy health pool usually meant I was free to engage, but make a few mistakes here and there. Take a hit or two if I messed up, back off, use a pulse cell, and get back in the fight. That just doesn't seem to be the case here at all. Even the most basic enemies in this DLC that come at you right from the off are potentially two-shotting me. And that doesn't feel great. I'll be honest, I certainly don't feel like I have a level 93 character. But the reverse is true as well. On the flip side, I'm also taking the majority of these smaller enemies down in 2 or 3 hits, depending on what kind of grindstone I've used, what element I've used, for example. So, rather than kind of just brute forcing my way through many of the lower ranks, it's turned into much more of a deadly dance of patience, perhaps akin to how the game felt when I first booted it up in 2023, and maybe that's what the developer was going for here. to knock those of us who had gotten a little complacent, a little too big for our boots, down a peg or two. And it's interesting how well this has kind of matched up to what I said in my last video prior to starting Overture. In that video, I mentioned how, although I'm not particularly good at the deflection mechanic, with the smallest trash mob enemies, I barely felt a need to even use it, because you can just outmaneuver them, you can just kill them pretty easily. The puppet string makes it so simple to take individual enemies out. But here, that's not the case. Here, I think deflection is going to be necessary against some of these smaller enemies who come at you in groups of 2 or 3. And yeah, it is undeniably frustrating to be wiped out by these extremely basic enemies who, you know, they are definitely not doing this kind of damage in the base game. Even at this kind of level. At this level, damage like this is reserved for the likes of the alchemist enemies found in the very final zone. And that is peculiar, I think, when you consider you can technically access Overture a full 2 chapters prior to ending the game. And I have no idea how your average Lies of P player is supposed to be tackling even this earliest portion of the DLC at that stage. And it's always kind of illuminating making a video like this. I mean, I love the challenge of Souls-likes, obviously, or else I wouldn't play them. And the most annoying thing about Lies of P adding difficulty settings now is that I know in the back of my mind there will be this pervasive thought that I could just drop the difficulty at any time and likely breeze through Overture with ease that will continue to rear its head every time I get annoyed. But considering I completed Lies of P in 2023 when there were no settings at all, you know, I definitely want to get this done on Legendary Stalker, but I mean, I haven't even faced the first boss yet, and the caliber of some of these enemies is off the charts. I mean, most of the footage in this video is probably just going to be me dying in a variety of ways. An eclectic mix of me playing horribly and making legitimate mistakes, exacerbated again by my own growing frustration, but also of moments where I truly don't think I could have done much else. But I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Oh boy, these new enemies are going to give me nightmares. For all the wrong reasons. First of all, though, I do want to highlight what I love about Overture already. The setting. Despite watching the trailers for this DLC, I somehow either didn't realise or completely forgot that this was going to be set, at least initially, in Krat Zoo, which is a very unusual and original setting for a game like this, and open the doors to all kinds of wonderfully weird and frankly horrific and unsettling creatures. These animals, which have been mutated beyond recognition in some cases, are simply way more eldritch and monstrous and alien than anything that was in the base game. And I've only started this DLC. But they look universally awesome, messed up, and above all else, creative. You have these dogs, for example, that simply might be the most annoying enemy I've encountered so far, which is very fitting for a Souls-like game. But they have these horrid, elongated mouths, and they leap at you, often congregating in a pack. And again, they do crazy amounts of damage. Then there are the monkeys, these huge baboon-like monstrosities that again look nightmarish. The way they break out of their cages in the very opening area is awesome, and actually these black third baboons are probably the most manageable of the new enemies I've found so far. They don't seem to have ridiculous attack patterns to memorize. Their damage output is, I'd say, appropriate. It is commensurate with the creature they are, and on the whole, they are not too tough to deal with. The giant, much larger monkeys are difficult, but the game positions them as such to be totally fair, and the same is true of the bears, who have this very annoying attack where they drive their heads down and just press you continuously with their spiked cages. But again, on the whole, when taken for what they are at face value, I don't necessarily think they are unreasonably hard, but they do deal a massive amount of damage and very quickly and very easily. Again, though, the environmental storytelling is wonderfully presented here. Krat Zoo is completely decimated and is one of the goriest, grisliest scenes we've ever seen in Lies of P, honestly tipping, I would say, the general vibe of the game away from the more theatrical, flamboyantly gothic, to straight-up horror, especially with some of the unholy transformations that occur. but the aforementioned bears have their heads locked in these gruesome, cruel, spiked cages, and the huge baboons are shackled, or at least they've broken free of those spiked bindings, but the evidence of their mistreatment is still there. You can imagine some greedy cabal who have stumbled upon the ability to create these monstrosities, and they are now flaunting them for the world to see at likely inflated prices, and of course that's now all gone to hell. It's now completely turned back around upon them. It's really cool, and again, like I said, very unique. Honestly, it's clever stuff, and it immediately creates a very compelling world, and it all looks fantastic too. Entering the Savannah Center, for example, is really weird, because you've never seen anything like it in Lies of P before, to the point where you're like, does this fit with the tone of this game? But it does. It's just another side of Krat that you haven't yet been exposed to. It's literally like you're on a kind of guided tourist trip around a zoo, to the extent where you can engage with all of the different descriptors of the various animals that are on show, and that's cool because it's completely unexpected and even alien, but that's what a DLC like this should be aiming for. You've sunk so many hours into the base game for this that's, decently priced. It's about £25 here in the UK. I think, we're going to give you something new. But anyway, back to the enemies, because that's really my only real point of reference right now after having, played it for about an hour or so. There are a couple of others I want to talk about. The kangaroos are the best kind of crazy. And again, not something I ever expected to see in a game like this, but squaring up with a kangaroo is both hilarious and abjectly terrifying. Now again, like with the monkeys beforehand, the smaller kangaroos, they're not too difficult to deal with, but then the difficulty is ramped up enormously with the larger ones, who seem to have enormous health pools in comparison, and deal a massive amount of damage. Now again, I know there are equivalent enemies like this in the base game. Some of the puppets, for example, the puppets that have been taken over and transformed and they get tentacles later on in the base game, they are tough as well. But a lot of the enemies in this are reminding me of some of Lies of P's absolute toughest, basic, quote-unquote, basic enemy experiences that you only face like 1, 2, 3 times in the game. Like the Jester puppet, for example, who is so difficult to defeat, but he doesn't show up that often. However, I'm getting that vibe from the bears, from the big monkeys, from the big kangaroos, and we'll get into it in a minute. The absolute worst of the worst that I have fought so far. But honestly, where the kangaroos are concerned, it is worth it for how funny the imagery is, even when these kangaroos are twisted abominations. But really, all of this comes to a head with one particular enemy that I've encountered so far. And again, this feels like it must be the tip of the iceberg, which is both exciting and terrifying. But one enemy that really takes the cake as feeling practically impossible to defeat, one that isn't just on the caliber of a boss fight from the base game, but frankly exceeds many of them in some ways. And that's the... well, I mean, I don't even really know what to call it. I guess it's most identifiably an elephant initially, but it is dragging a pair of spindly horse legs behind it, which is honestly pretty creepy. And the first one I came across didn't really put up much of a fight, aside from almost killing me in a single hit, but apart from that, it didn't really present itself as anything out of the ordinary. And then I met the second one. And it's really around this second elephant-esque enemy that this video, the crux of this video, revolves. Because I haven't fought a single other non-boss enemy in Lies of P that feels so insurmountable as this. This thing should have a name at the bottom of the screen. Of course, the battle begins like the previous encounter, successfully tricking you into thinking you're in for more of the same, though the close proximity to the Stargazer and the relative prominence of its arena are slight giveaways as to the truth. But as the fight progresses, this elephant creature transforms into a monstrosity that would frankly make Bloodborne blush, as an entire giraffe-like neck suddenly bursts forth from a pulsating tumour on its head, turning the creature into a sort of elephant-giraffe-dinosaur hybrid, without a better way of describing it. Not only that, but the creature's new head is actually an amalgamation of multiple heads, the likes of a crocodile and a zebra, and God only knows what else. It is truly hideous in the best possible way. You know someone had a lot of fun designing this thing, but the creature feels impossible to kill. Now, obviously it's not, but it has a huge health pool, it hits like a truck, and once this new head emerges, it begins breathing frost all over the place. A new status ailment introduced in Overture, which feels again particularly devastating, not only causing your health to continuously drain over time, but it also slows your attack and movement speeds, effectively shutting you down. And I can't help but wonder as well, I've noticed the inclusion of two new items. Now, I can't remember exactly what they're called off the top of my head, but they are these individual elixirs. So far, they have only been one-offs, but you get like a bright green one and a gold one, and they are basically designed to buff all of your stats for a temporary amount of time. And I can't help but think the inclusion of these new elixirs, these new ampoules, is because the developers knew this was very, very hard. Like, on another level to the base game. Now, like I said earlier, it is interesting making videos like this. Really, it's just giving me an avenue to vent, and I appreciate you being on the receiving end of it. Of course, I'm gonna dive back in later and keep hacking away at these things, hopefully improving my game, and potentially stealing some scant opportunities to level up elsewhere. For now, I simply circumvented it after losing several times, but I will return. I mean, I'm assuming this is an enemy that won't respawn, but I could be wrong, which does make it worthwhile to eventually take down. But I mean, I love it all the same, and I'm very excited to see what else Overture has in store. However, there's no denying that, on the flip side, for a player like myself who isn't a pro by any means, this DLC right out of the gate feels like genuinely one of the hardest Souls-like experiences I have ever encountered. And this enemy is the embodiment of that. I definitely don't feel like a level 93 character, or a player that has a remote handle in this game whatsoever, that's for sure. It's been a humbling experience, but at the same time it does kind of feel like we've been here before. I've certainly been through this humbling process at least a couple of times. But you know, it does also make sense from a design perspective. As a player, I certainly wouldn't want to just breeze through this expansion after waiting for it for so long. But there is a juxtaposition there. The base game, it simply is not this hard after having just completed it. But as always, I am, like I said, excited to grow and to improve and to hopefully get better, to the point where even Overture becomes totally doable. As is often the case, I think it's just going to be about re-engineering the way I think about and approach this game in particular. Although, I eventually got through Kazan without any summons or anything like that, and I still maintain that I never fully got to grips with that game's combat either. It's funny though, I went through pretty much the exact same motions with Bloodborne. Earlier this year for the 10th anniversary, I replayed the entire thing on a new save, including the old hunters, and yeah, the expansion is a step up in difficulty from the base game, but not like this. Or maybe I've just played Bloodborne so many times at this point that I don't notice it so much anymore. That's definitely a possibility. Like I said at the start of this video, Shadow of the Erdtree felt similarly quite rough initially too, but again I think I settled into it fairly quickly, and that was after a similar kind of wait between Elden Ring and its expansion as we just experienced now with Lies of P. So yeah, Overture is really difficult, and I appreciate you sitting through my stream of consciousness as I attempt to formulate some very early impressions, while also ranting about how bloody difficult this stupid elephant giraffe thing is to fight. I haven't even found the first boss yet, though I have an idea who it is based on some of the lore drops that have been building, and that is a terrifying prospect. However, I've only spent, like I said, an hour or so with the DLC, so maybe I'm just expecting too much. That being said, Overture is immediately compelling. The setting of Krat Zoo is fantastically unique, and the team has already used it really well, creating some truly individual environments, the likes of which you never see in Lies of P itself, like the monkey enclosure, for example, which is so interesting to move around in and scale. Though I stopped appreciating it so much when I was killed after a monkey sniped me from afar, leading to an undignified end for poor old Pinocchio. One of many, I have to admit. And actually that feels very reminiscent of Sekiro. But anyway, I've rambled for more than long enough. My initial hour or so with Overture has been positive, but brutal. I'm very keen to dive back in pretty much as soon as I finish editing this, but my two main takeaways so far are that Krat Zoo makes for a great setting with some awesome enemies, though I am hoping to see some puppet enemies again at some point, as they are my favourites to fight, and this is maybe the hardest DLC I have ever played in my entire life, and I've barely scratched the surface. But trust me, I am very excited to see more. Oh, and Pinocchio's new outfit you get at the start of this expansion is very cool. This game continues to excel in the style department. Alright everyone, but that does it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took something of value away from it as well, even if that value was just found in listening to me lament and rant about the Overture DLC so far. Don't take the wrong impression, I am really enjoying it, and it does feel very fresh, even after coming off of the initial Lies of P playthrough, and I can't wait to hopefully bring you some further impressions, maybe even a review or something later on down the line if we actually manage to make our way through it. And I think we will. Perseverance is always the key. I think it's doable. We'll have to see. Okay, everyone, once again, thank you so very much for being here and for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video and you want to see more from me in the channel, consider hitting subscribe today and help push us towards our next major milestone of 15,000 subs. We're very close to 13,000, less than 100 subs away. So if you want to be part of that final push to get us over the hump, to get us to 13,000, again, I really would appreciate it. A massive thank you to everyone who has subscribed over the last few days or so after having watched that last Lies of P video. Again, it really does mean the world to me. But yeah, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, we'll catch you later, and let's talk games again.